Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. So pleased you could join us today for our fourth Fellows in the Field workshop, Student Organizing and Activism, Educating to Inspire Principled Action. With the presidential election less than 2 weeks away, following a summer of some of the greatest activism in American history, this workshop could not be more relevant. And today you are all in for a real treat, and that treat is being able to learn with and from Dr. Spoma Jovanovic. Spoma is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Since 2001, she's been teaching students there how to collaborate with community members on programs and activist strategies designed to enhance ethical conversations and action related to civic literacy, cultural understanding, democratic participation, and social justice. She is the author of the book, Democracy, Dialogue, and Community Action, Truth and Reconciliation in Greensboro. Just so people know, that's literally on my bedside table right now. And editor of Partnerships, a journal of service learning and civic engagement. Spoma's scholarship has been featured in dozens of academic journal articles and book chapters, as well as in national magazines, daily newspapers, and a 2013 TEDx Greensboro talk. Her communication activism has included launching with the community the first U.S. Truth and Reconciliation process, bringing participatory budgeting to her city and advancing political engagement with an urban high school, as well as expanding spaces for free speech. It is with great pride that I share that Spoma recently completed a fellowship with the center, during which she considered the ways and means by which activists express themselves in order to activate civic engagement. She interviewed and wrote stories of activists who've been at the front lines of protest and civil disobedience, and created an instructional guide for students and community members to accompany those stories. The work, I highly recommend it. It's exceptional. The link to her work, along with a full recording of today's session, will be included in the event recap email. The chat and Q&A functions are available, and I know that Spoma is interested in the dynamic interactive discussion, so please don't hesitate to pose questions and comments throughout our time together. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Spoma.
Thank you, Michelle. And thanks everybody for being here. We're going to be talking today about student organizing and activism, but before we do, I just want to give a shout out to Michelle Deutschman and her staff, and to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Being a fellow with this center has been a highlight of my professional career, and to be around such smart people who are really interested in topical issues so important today, it's just been amazing. So thank you, Michelle, and thanks everybody for being here today. All right, we're gonna get going. That's me, you've seen me. But this is kind of an overview of what I'd like to discuss today. And at any point along the way, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. Michelle will interrupt me if I don't see them, so that we can just address them as we go. That would be great. But we're gonna talk about the notion of hope, and then where the community fits in with that, what critical skills, values, knowledge we need to really inculcate in higher education, and then look at how community activists can help us do that to really enhance academic scholarship and debates. So when we talk about the notion of principled hope, here's the thing. I think students have great interest to engage in the big issues of our time. But for many of them, it's their very first time doing so. Now, some are, of course, experienced, and we can learn a lot from them. And I love having students who are experienced in the field come around and share their stories. But most students, at least I've found, are unfamiliar, don't know exactly what to do. And so it's not just that we just go out and do anything, but that we base our actions and our organizing on principled hope, that we can have the world that we really want. So many students are getting involved with Black Lives Matter, as you know, maybe women's reproductive rights, that's a popular one, as well as LGBTQ issues. In Greensboro, as Michelle mentioned, we've been working on the Truth and Reconciliation process. Even though that happened over 10 years ago, its impact and effects continues today, along with some other things like participatory budgeting and so on and so forth. So there's lots of opportunities in our community, and I'm sure in your community, for students to get engaged. But we need to make some connections so that they can see how hopeful and how rich the possibilities are. Okay, so as I think about student activism and organizing, I really want us to question what are our commitments. So we can prioritize democratically based teaching and research, but we don't always do that. Yet students need to know how to access grassroots organizing efforts as well as traditional government pathways to creating change in the community. And we can support, the educators can support that effort in that quest by making introductions and by showing how to do it. It is really, it's really troubling sometimes to me what students don't know, but I don't blame them. Of course, I blame us. How come we haven't taught them? So why is this important for the students? Well, of course, they need to learn and understand free speech, the limits of it, the constraints, where it's appropriate. They want to express themselves. We know that, and that's a good thing, right? Similarly, they want to be engaged civically. Sometimes I see students that, and you probably do too, who haven't been engaged, but it's usually not because they don't want to, they just don't know how. And so to connect them with social change efforts or social movements, particularly those that stand for justice and equality, seems to be the calling of higher education. So how do we develop or support those civic habits for democracy? And we're going to talk today in here or explore what are those civic habits they ought to be learning. But what I do know is that when we start to teach these skills and these habits and this knowledge, what we're really doing is teaching students how to have the confidence as well as learning how to struggle and how to have grace in a world that is in great need of that right now. So before I move off of this slide, though, I want to just say one more thing about why this is important for students. Just a couple weeks ago, we hosted in our community something called democracy tables, where people came together to talk about voting and some of the issues. And a number of students from the area got on that call. And it was surprising, I guess I would say, to learn that many of them, not one, many of them thought that the only thing we were voting on November 3rd was either for Trump or Biden. They had no idea that, like, on my ballot, there are 39 races and 2 referendums. They had no idea. And so they, clearly at that point, they were ill prepared to go into the voting booth. And for many of them, it was going to be the first time. So something's amiss that's not happening either at home or in K through 12 education. And so for me, voting has always been like, a pretty low bar. We got voting. We need to do voting for sure, but we need to do a lot more. But I'm thinking I need to spend more time talking about voting with students. And the second reason for me why this is important is that there was a study that was just done by Rethink, this organization, Media for Equality, and they've finished this study October 9th. So, just now, September and October. They went to over 1,500 registered voters as part of the study and found that 80% of Americans have never participated in a demonstration, a rally, or a protest. And so that piece of expression, that part of the First Amendment, is pretty abstract to most people, including students. Again, some students have participated, but many have not. So what do we need to do to kind of expand the resources that students have in order to express themselves, be active, and to be able to organize in the community? One of the reasons why I came into higher education is because it is this one very sacred space where we can be champions for democracy, right? Our classrooms are political spaces where we can cultivate democratic sensibilities. And for me, that means that this is a real ethical act, I think. There's the legal part of the First Amendment, which is really important. And I'm not going to be talking about any of that here today, none of the cases, but rather what are the things that the First Amendment offers us, to express ourselves, to dissent, to organize. Those are pretty important features of democracy. So as we're doing this, I think it's also my colleagues of color were gracious enough to let me know this third point on the slide, that we need to recognize that many students have been touched by trauma, many students in one way or another, and that they need the words, the stories, and the resources in order to be able to respond to the adversities that they are facing. And, that's no more evident than with COVID right now. But there are many other, racial violence and other issues surrounding us in our community that students are not, they're not missing out, unfortunately, on some of these very troubling times. So I'm going to be talking a lot about what faculty can do, and one of the best things that we can do, of course, is learn from the youth. And this is a picture of a rally that was that followed the tragic killing of the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida. And I just want to do a shout out to those students from that high school who were inspired by the freedom riders of the 60s. They went on tour. You probably remember that. They were equipped with knowledge even before this tragedy at their high school about guns and gun violence. And so when tragedy struck, they did not stop. They famously said, "We don't want your prayers, we want your action." And they launched a national movement. Young people, 17 years old, 16 years old. They partnered with the Women's March. They confronted the National Rifle Association. They met with politicians, and they organized actions all across the country. They advocated with our U.S. Congress to ban the sale of weapons, to require comprehensive back checks, to make sure that we raise the minimum age for purchasing guns, all sorts of things. I mean, they're really an inspiration to all of us. And I think we have students in our midst likewise who have done remarkable things. So in this picture, what you're seeing is we hosted on my campus, along with many other campuses, a month after the shooting in 2018, 17 minutes of silence, where students came out, and this is what faculty can do. We allowed students to encouraged students to leave our classrooms. We brought out paper and pens so they could create their own signs if they wanted to, and they could be in the midst of one another as we had a few small speeches, but mostly they were together, honoring such a tragic event. So our students are a great source of inspiration, I think. Now, this one, let's see if this, oh dear. Let's see if we can get this going. That's okay. This, in our community, we also, like many of you perhaps, have had a response to the racial violence and policing. This is a mural that was painted on the street. There are many of them. And this is the thing. Students learn from our communities. They learn what issues are important, and they learn the appropriate boundaries of how you ought to respond. So it becomes very important for them to see and work with community organizers and activists. And that's going to be, I think, one takeaway from this session that I hope you will grab onto, which is meet community organizers and bring them together with students. This one, of course, was about race and policing, but we've also seen students work with community members on voter disenfranchisement and thus voter registration and getting out into the polls and poll watchers now. Certainly the debate over whether to wear masks or not, all of those kinds of things, community members are well-versed in tackling and can really be strong partners with students. So it's not just locally though either. As even though we're not traveling out of the country for the most part, there are national and world events that can certainly capture the attention and interest and enthusiasm of our students. Last year, before COVID, I had the opportunity to go to England and look at Speaker's Corner, where people since 1866 have been coming together to talk and debate and to argue, sometimes in circles, sometimes in the more pontificating style. But in any case, this rich space in Hyde Park where people learn so much from one another, which I think is really the bedrock of democracy. I came back to the United States and tried to start a speaker's corner at one of our events, but I think that might be on my plate for future work, not as a place to restrict speech, but as a place where people know they could go and talk with one another. A lot of those spaces for political conversation have really evaporated from our public spaces, replaced by entertainment, which we all enjoy. There's nothing wrong with entertainment, but to have spaces dedicated for political conversations and having political friendships seems like a really rich opportunity. Another one that I went to see was the launch of the Yellow Vests in France, which really started with people in neighborhoods saying there was going to be a tax on fuel. And for people in rural areas, and people have been increasingly pushed out of the cities in France because of the high cost of living there, this fuel tax was going to fall heavily on low income and displaced rural people. They gathered at roundabouts to talk to their neighbors, to say what's going on. They wore those yellow vests, which, the construction vests. In France, that's required to keep in the trunk of your car in case you have a car breakdown. We might want to take a lesson from that one. But these were people who their major calling, and there were episodes of violence. I don't want to, pretend that there weren't, but by and large, their call was humanity over money. That was their message, that they wanted to take care of people and make sure that there was a better way forward. Students can learn from that, take inspiration from that. So as we think about, and again, if you have anything you want to interject, just, please do. As we think about faculty, and I guess this would apply for students, I'm always of the mind that we ought to work from where we are. So for example, when I first moved to Greensboro, my very first class luckily I had seniors. So I'm thinking, okay, they've been in Greensboro for 4 years. I don't know any groups here. And I was madly trying to find out who's who, what's what. So I gave them an assignment to go find a grassroots organization or nonprofit that targeted or was interested in justice, and to write up a profile on that. And it fit very well with the class that we were in. But that was a way for me to learn from students and for students to learn more about their community. And it provided an opportunity in the classroom to work where I was, which was I knew nothing, right? So if that's the case, then we can work together. We want to know who are the local organizers making change happen. We also want to think about how can we lend our expertise as faculty members, as students, to whatever efforts are happening in our community. And we need to look for, in our campus network, find people who are doing this sort of work. And if we don't know who they are, maybe we should create our own event and see who will be drawn to us. And I think that's how we start making these connections. The last point on here, and I can't stress this again enough, is that when students organize, I want to be acting and organizing with them. So we had, and again, you've probably had similar kinds of things in your area, but sometimes students face obstacles and faculty can play a nice role of stepping in. Students, at one point we had free speech zones on our campus. Thankfully, we don't have that anymore. But when they needed support, I went and stood with them and protested with them about that. When Hurricane Katrina struck, this was a funny one. I don't know, for whatever reason, the campus didn't want the students to chalk on campus. That was somehow defacing things. Now, I know rain gets rid of chalk, but, it was a faculty member who had to say, wait a minute, this is okay. And kind of get rid of some of the obstacles that students would otherwise have to face. When flash mobs were important, I remember, campus officials saying, oh, you need a permit to have a flash mob. And it's like, really? So we can, there are things that we can do wherever we are to kind of help students in their quest to be active and to organize. In our own classrooms, I'm hoping that we can create the spaces that cultivate democratic sensibilities. Often that means sitting in circles. And as this picture depicts, it's having charts up on the wall, really grappling with issues. That when we start to shift our pedagogy to encourage active engagement, I think we are really greeted with tremendous enthusiasm by students, even when they don't always know exactly what to say or how to say it. Well, shoot, I don't either. So why don't we do that together? I always think, well, I'm in, my field is communication studies, so it's pretty easy to talk about almost anything. But I always think, well, math classes, nobody, I shouldn't say nobody likes to take math, but a lot of students don't like to take math, particularly in our major. But I think, well, if I was teaching math, I would teach geometry, for instance, by building a deck for a Habitat for Humanity house or any one of the organizations that's working with low-income homeowners. And wouldn't that be a fun way and interesting way to learn about math and also benefit the community? There are so many opportunities, no matter what the discipline. And I think the point here is to provide some disruptive moments. Let the students also do that as in the classroom. So, well, let's say I had students at one point, they were very excited about being active in the community, and they were going to stage a die-in in front of a museum because a museum wasn't allowing a certain exhibit to be there. And it happened to be on a tragic moment in our history, which the Truth and Reconciliation process was built. And so they said, we're going to have a die-in. And I said, well, okay, that's pretty disruptive in the middle of the street downtown. But have you talked to anybody about, why they're not having this exhibit, or tried to convince them that they should have the exhibit? So I think this idea of disruption, yes, but also how can we reconstruct things or rebuild our community? And if there was to be a die-in, there's got to be something afterwards too, still, right? There still has to be this discussion and where do we go from here? So really emphasizing with students the full range of what it means to be active in our community. So here's where I want to ask you to kind of respond, if you will. So if we are to teach students the democratic arts and skills, I kind of put those into what are those skills? What's the knowledge? What values do we need to be teaching in the classroom to cultivate student activism and organizing? What do you think? If you want to type it in the chat, I'm going to give you just a second to do that. And then I'm going to show you what I've learned from people. I've been asking this question for quite some time.
Hey, Spoma.
Yes?
I just want to make sure you can see the chat.
Yep, I'm looking now. So yeah, great. So I'm seeing things like public speaking, coalition building, right? Assessment, active listening, of course, yes. Okay, you can keep typing if you want, and I'm going to move on. But I'd love to capture whatever you say. What I've done, I've been asking people, and I broke it down into 9 broad categories. So many of the specific things you're mentioning, I think you'll find in here. This is based on I'm putting 558 responses. I think it's more, but I've been asking at conferences, in classrooms, all over, faculty, staff, administrators. So I put them into 9 broad categories. The first one is, and this one is from students. So, I always start with students. They want specific current issues brought into the classroom so that they can bridge their own experiences and their classroom learning with that. What they've told me is that they get their news, and we know increasingly not from the newspaper and not even from television. And that's been on the downhill slide for the last, 20, 30 years. But where they're getting it, of course, is their social media feed primarily. And they know that social media feed is skewed and it's incomplete, but they don't know where to get information. So I think bringing in current issues, bringing in different places and things to read is very helpful for students to broaden the knowledge base of current issues. To do that, I think that we need to host conversations for students. And this is where we practice that kind of active listening, and they get to identify arguments that are in these hot topics. They get to justify their position and they get to practice in a classroom, which I would not say is a safe space necessarily, but it's definitely a space where there are resources, where faculty member, other students, where it's designed to learn and they can practice and gain some of the confidence of what it means to talk about these issues. This third one is to really address misinformation and to uncover what community resources are there that students can turn to get information, and to recognize too that, I guess that there are community members taking action in the very things that they are concerned about. Again, many students think nothing's going on, when in fact, so much is happening in the community. We don't always read about it in the newspaper, and they certainly don't read about it, so they don't know. So to be able to kind of amplify what is happening, what community groups and people are doing, and then, to end with that, we do have a duty to dissent. Just as much as we have a duty to vote and obey the laws, we have a duty to express dissent and critique where it's warranted, particularly, of course, when we have injustices that persist. So those are the first three things around which many of these things that you're talking about fall. Yes.
Can I insert just a question that came in the queue?
Yes.
Someone asking, one of the issues in some predominantly white institutions located in a small town is that we face opposition from the community and the school administration when we want to organize and students fear for their safety. Do you have any advice?
Yes, do it anyway. I think, living is risky business, and there are risks. I think we try and mitigate those as much as possible. I don't know if in predominantly white institutions and communities, it seems like there would be far less risk, but what do I know? I actually think there's risk everywhere. And so what does that mean? I tend to go to many of the events with students. Not that I'm going to be any, big protector of anything, but rather to be able to be there in case something were to arise. I'll give a very simple example. I take my students to for more than 10 years, it was 15 years. I took my students to an urban high school, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And at this, so it happened to be all white students that day that I took into the high school. And there was a fight that broke out, and, there was a, SRO, what do you call it? Student resource officer, and like pinning one of the students down. It was a little scary, and like, what are we walking into? What are we getting in the middle of? And so because I was there, we could process that, we could talk about it and recognize that actually this is probably not that different than what happens in other schools. It may not have been something they'd seen before, but it was managed and handled, and we could move on. And we had no problem the rest of the semester, but to have that first jolt of reaction. Now, I don't want to be naive. We are living in times where we're having protests and counter protests. And my goal is certainly not for anybody to get in harm's way. So I do think that students need to also have options and choices. And if it's just too uncomfortable, it's just too uncomfortable to participate in that way. But there are many ways to be active in our communities, and COVID again is surfacing some of the more socially distant, or I don't want to say socially, physically distant ways to do that. So I know we have students calling up now, doing calls for voter registration and getting people out to the polls. That's a form of activism. So there are ways to participate that don't have to be just about protest. So maybe that's, and let me finally, I know in our area, when there have been questions, we've contacted the campus police and asked them to be there and just have a presence if that's helpful. Sometimes that is helpful and sometimes it's not. But if there are concerns and fears, that might be one way to work on it. And maybe other people have other ideas too. I hope that answers that. So all of this is designed to teach students how they can speak out. And so following up on the question, there are many, many ways to participate in our democracy. And let me just say, I think activism is going to public meetings hosted by our local government and expressing your view. That's not particularly risky, but it's very important, right? Organizing collective actions around any sort of thing, learning how to draft resolutions or legislation. So an example is we had students working with a low-income housing group and low-income housing group, but really with a certain community. And that community was renting homes that were not being maintained well by the landlords. So the students did videos, and let me tell you, the renters in this area were nervous, so none of their faces were shown. You could hear voices, you could see the backs of their heads, but they did not want because they were concerned their landlords would retaliate. So this video was made showing some of the conditions in the homes. And that video was taken and shown to the city council and led to a change in landlord policy and maintenance. The video was also taken and used to get a grant for the nonprofit organization to actually do repairs in those communities. So, that is an incredible opportunity for students to not only learn video, interviewing skills, but learn about issues in their community and actually make a positive difference. And that's related to this second point, how we need to broker these introductions to activists, nonprofit organizations, others with whom we can create alliances. So when we show students how to create messages, how to do whatever, whether it's writing something, the same group, another group of students for the same nonprofit actually wrote some draft legislation and presented that. And, so they're learning all kinds of skills in this process. That doesn't only mean protesting, demonstrations, and rallies, although that could also be part of it, right? And then finally, the last three things in terms of what we might need to, broad categories of what we need to help students with is building knowledge. We can share the resources that we have available in our communities. So in my city of 300,000, we have over 600 nonprofits. Surely some of them can be helpful to students. So we need to make those introductions. The other thing here is, as well as I don't want to leave out city officials and staff, county commissions, staff and people and the meetings and where they are, the Board of Education. I mean, I literally put on syllabi where these meetings take place, what time they take place, the address, and create an assignment to go to one of the meetings, even just to listen and see what's going on as a student's first foray into meetings. I remember a student who was homeschooled, came into college, was getting all A's, and I had this assignment, go to a city council meeting, and she said, "Am I allowed to?" So again, we're starting off with and she's so smart, but she didn't know. And how could she know? Because she'd never encountered it before. We can do some of that heavy lifting of identifying what's possible for students and marry it with our disciplinary areas. I think this one of introducing our own history in our own country and the genealogy of activism, this came also from my African-American colleagues who couldn't say it strongly enough that we need to showcase the very fine work that African-Americans and white Americans have made advances in our lifetime and prior to it. So we're celebrating right now, of course, the 100 years of the suffrage movement, but it was about 100 years of work before we got the right to vote. And it didn't happen very civilly. I mean, there were civil moments, but a lot of uncivil moments too. And I think we need to talk about that. And it's not talked about very often. Disability rights, the American Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990, but it took about 50 years of discussion and pushing and struggling. And so to let students know that some of their efforts too may take some time, I think is an important lesson. I try and tell them, we have this 8-hour workday for those who work that kind of schedule. And that was a big advance when we got it in 1937, but it was really Philadelphia carpenters some 47 years before that started saying, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't have to be working 12 hours a day or 16 hours a day. So again, kind of bringing that to the foreground so that when Black Lives Matter doesn't get every change that they want right now, we don't want to be, not pushing, but we also need to know that these struggles take some time and they build on the work of other things in order to create change. And then finally, again, this notion of students' bewilderment and trauma that is pervasive, that can be a really rich source of stories if students want to share that, to be able to talk about what we need to do. I have a student who talked about a lynching in her community when she was in high school. And she's not, 50 years old. She's 22 years old. And she was dismayed at the lack of response by her community to what was awful, awful, awful. It was as if it didn't happen, tried to just, push it under the rug. So that can really energize students to say, wait a minute, we need to understand, we need to know, we need to respond. What more can we do? There's always more, right? So like thinking about more traditional ways, here's the thing. We have lots of opportunities to collaborate with each other, with our faculty, with students, to form alliances across disciplines on issues that matter to us. Maybe we can even write in ways that are evocative and important for the community. Almost all of my work eventually ends up in academic journals, but it also ends up in community documents that are useful for the community to use, or maybe becomes a flyer or a brochure or a report of some kind, similar to what we saw with the students working with the nonprofit group. Maybe it's a video or a white paper. I think in our classroom discussions, I'm not going to blame students for this one. It's probably more the critics. Graduate students, they want to be so critical, as do faculty. And there's a great place for that. We need critical scholars, but we also need to make sure that we're not perseverating on this rhetoric of blame. And we move to, well, what can we do? We know these things exist. They're things that we want to change. So rather than just, saying somebody else isn't doing it, what can we do? And how can we move things along? This doesn't absolve people from their responsibilities or accountability, but it's a way to help students get to this notion of principled hope that we started with. So, and then if we finish with positive examples, historically, currently, research findings where we see changes and shifts occurring, and they are happening all the time. Sometimes when we're in the midst of them, we don't even have time to stop. Actually, I think this is one of the greatest roles that scholars can contribute to community activism. Again, faculty and students, when I say scholars, and that is grassroots organizers and activists. They are busy doing the work, the day-to-day work. Somebody needs to write it up. Somebody needs to kind of count the wins and the accomplishments and showcase those and make sure that everybody knows that. That's important. So here's an example, again, of a local action. George Floyd's death and that of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. But George Floyd certainly catalyzed, I think, a lot of people and disrupted what we knew about the police or what we wanted to believe about the police. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, what it did was it rejuvenated an effort that had been going on for about not quite 2 years. And that was in the fall of 2018, Marcus Dion Smith was a 40-ish year old man who was walking around downtown one evening, dazed, confused, asking for help. The police responded and decided that they call an ambulance. And while the ambulance was on its way, they asked Marcus Smith to sit in the squad car. Remember, he was walking around agitated. Well, in the car, I don't know if he got claustrophobic. I don't know what happened, but he hit the window with the palm of his hand. The police pulled him out and then restrained him by pulling his arms behind his back and his feet too behind his back, also known as hog tying. And he started gasping, reminiscent of George Floyd, and then he died. The paramedics had arrived on the scene, and they watched all of this happen, and took several minutes before they actually started resuscitation efforts, but it was too late. And in a really eerily similar to what happened to George Floyd, there have been many accounts saying that if only medical attention had been provided sooner, maybe George Floyd would not have died, and the same thing for Marcus Smith. Well, again, Marcus Smith, this was 2 years prior. Once George Floyd incident happened, we saw a rejuvenation of interest. Faculty and students, and these are students holding the banner from one of the local colleges, came out on Mondays for Marcus every Monday in front of the municipal building and across the street from the police. Actually, the building behind this is the police building. There are people asking for justice, asking for changes in policing. Now, it's been 2 years. They want restitution for the family who had to bury their son and didn't even have the money to do it. And so the community raised the money. And while there haven't been specific changes in policing with regard to this, like it hasn't been written into the policy that there will be no hog tying, even though that was the cause of death. It was ruled a homicide by the state. The community is persisting. And it's the students and faculty following the lead of the community to make sure there are people there that are applying pressure. That's an important lesson, I think, for students. So I'm looking at the time. So again, this is kind of to kind of recap where we are. Students' knowledge of social change may be shallow. Faculty knowledge of social change efforts and how to do it may be shallow. So we can support both by drawing on our history, getting more information and information literacy knowledge, distinguishing narratives and facts, cultivating these features of resilience, empathy, ethical grounding, as you were saying, active listening, respect. All of those kinds of things are important to do in our classrooms. The community famously says that what they do is they're working on a movement, not a moment. And likewise, I think we as faculty and students have to see this not as a class project, but as a lifetime commitment. How are we going to respond to the world that we live in? At the same time, we can use our pedagogical resources to create like some short-term projects that contribute to larger efforts. So I mentioned before, I worked with an urban high school and we wanted to get more bus benches and shelters in our community. 94% of our bus stops had no shelter and 80% didn't even have a bench. So that means that 8 out of 10 had nothing but a little sign. And so the college students with high school students started working on that. But we created one new bus shelter and several benches during 10 years. So each semester we would do a different project. One did one on a photo voice to illustrate what were the problems. Another project did an umbrella drive and had a photo op in front of a bus stop to say, look, what happens when it's raining. And then they donated the umbrellas to a day shelter for homeless people. One semester they wrote letters to the editor. Another, they did fundraising appeals to local groups, and they learned about persuasive speaking. So there are ways in which to scaffold all of these things. Stories from our community activists inspire us. So I want to show you a short video, really short, 3 minutes, that when we do this, we recognize the hard work of ordinary people and we connect students to the community. Oh, is it not going to? Oh, wow. The video is not on. I don't know. Well, let me just tell you.
Just click it and give it one more sec, Spoma.
Okay. I don't see the arrow on here for some reason. This is Casey Thomas. She's all of 30 years old, and she is a major force in our community. She organizes And what she, I don't think it's going to play. So it's okay. I'll show you a little bit more. Here's her quote. She says, "I think it's important that we recognize that there are a variety of roles that people can play in movement work and getting us toward the future that we all deserve." She is super wise. She's 30 years old, right? And she's doing that. She's organizing in her neighborhood, in the community around all kinds of issues. Some of you may have read books by Danielle Allen. She's a political philosopher. And she reminds us too that politics is a life shared with words, much more and much better than with force or war. But to do that requires that we be self-conscious, that we understand how power is negotiated, and that we aim toward freedom and happiness for everyone. This video of Casey is one of 10 that we developed during the fellowship, and they'll be available for you to see. This is a discussion guide that goes with this particular one. And the idea here was really to give a resource to students to meet community organizers, but it's also a resource for faculty who may not be familiar with community organizers and action in their own communities. So this whole unit could be just in the classroom where they watch the video and then they do some, they have some discussion or they do some research out of class and they come back and talk about neighborhood association work and different ways to be engaged. Or it could be the introduction to Casey actually in the community, and then the next step is to go meet with her. So finally, I just want to say that faculty and student scholarship, and I'm talking about research and teaching and service, all of these things we engage in all the time. And we can do so in ways that amplify the needs in our community and the benefits that can be provided through our universities and colleges. We have students who are tremendous resources for our community. We just need to make those connections. I'm one of the most popular people in my community because community groups know they can come to me and they will find students who will do some, just folding envelopes. Does anybody even do that anymore? But, folding papers to put stuffing the envelopes, but really get involved in many of the important issues. And they need young people, they want their perspectives. They want not just their hands and their feet to do the work, but their thoughts and their strategies and their teaching moments. And together we can really make something happen in our communities. I see that as our responsibility in higher education, to engage with, to critique, and to learn and to teach about the economic, the political, the racial, all the complex issues in our life that students are facing, not just when they graduate, but right now while they are in school. And so I'm hoping that we all spread this word, of how we can support students to be strong organizers, to be activists. And I think along the way, and this is I'm just letting you know that when we do that, they make us better organizers and activists too, on campus and off. So thank you. I know we have a few minutes, I suppose. So questions or thoughts?
I'm going to give people a minute to enter some questions into the Q&A. And I'm just going to start by saying thank you. I feel like hope is something that is in really short supply right now. And so I'm so grateful that you provided us so much of it. And I can see some comments about outstanding, so motivating. Let me look in the Q&A. One of my questions I wanted to, before we get to the one in the Q&A, has to do with this idea of tenure and about risk, and that it's not just risky for students in terms of safety, but faculty members feeling concerned about their ability to get tenure if they're quote unquote too active. And I didn't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yes, great. So thank you. Sometimes faculty come to me and they say, well, should I call my course community? Just community, like don't let on that there's anything about social justice, about organizing, about activism. And should I, as a faculty member, stay low until I get tenure? And what I want to say is, no, what I found is that for faculty who decide not to do anything until they get tenure, once they get tenure, they've figured out they better not say anything anymore. I mean, it doesn't seem to work. I think we do. I think there are lots of ways to be active, to be engaged, to promote all of this, and do it some with a little less risk than others. And I think one way is giving your courses names that maybe aren't as politically hot. That can be one way, and certainly talking with department heads and deans and all sorts of people about what it is that you're doing. But I would never take the advice of don't be active and don't support organizing, not even from my dean or my department head. I'd work on changing their minds early on. And in fact, I know that's what I had to do. And, it's a commitment, and so, and there are risks but there are risks in everything. I think I've said that before, everything. And I think the greater risk is not stepping up and speaking out and supporting students. I think that the experience of teaching and research is just far less robust, frankly.
Thank you. All right. A question from one of your fellows, John Wilson. He writes, activism is often ideological. Do faculty and staff help support activism when they disagree with it? How do you encourage students who disagree with you to express their activism?
That's a great question, John. So I know where this came up for me was when Trump was elected. So 90% in this one particular class, not 99% of the students were pretty upset about Trump being elected. And I knew there was a student in there who was actually very pro-Trump. My view is, I think I want to encourage activism and organizing on whatever the issue. So if somebody, and I've already put I've staked out my space. I'm going for justice and equality. Others are going for gun rights. That would not be mine. But you know what? They have a right to do that, and they need to learn how to do it as well. I would hope that the values of higher education speak to respecting the dignity of all people. And I think, for instance, regarding race and equality, and that we need to definitely forward messages of inclusion, of acceptance, of appreciation, all of those kinds of things. And there are going to be students who have different views. I tend to raise the other side if it doesn't come up. I think it's important to at least have it on the table. It doesn't mean I'm going to do that kind of work, and I'm pretty upfront about that. I think we need to say to students, and we need to be sincere about that. You do not have to agree with anything that's said in this classroom by me or anybody else. If you're showing, let's say in a paper or in an assignment of some sort, you have strong arguments, you have evidence, that I think we want that. I mean, that's important. The debates that are happening out in the world are also happening in the classroom. So we can have some of that happen. I'll give you one quick example. We had a student in one of my classes, and this is, by the way, this class, you get the students evaluated. This is the highest marks I ever got in a class. So I'm telling you that because it was pretty contentious. One student basically said, I don't believe in interracial marriage. I think it's a sin, and on and on and on. And we had biracial students in the class who just stood up and started screaming, crying. Then we had another student say, well, it's not just interracial marriage. I don't think, Jews and Christians should marry. And and we were talking about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And all of this started escalating with pretty, to me, pretty, not very tolerant views. I wouldn't say they were abhorrent, but I was surprised, but there it was. And it started going. So we ended the class. Everybody was crying and screaming. We came back over a series of about 4 to 5 weeks. We kept revisiting the issues that were raised on that one day, not until the end of class. Nobody wanted to discuss it at the beginning. So I'd let them go. And then usually the last 20 minutes, we'd get into it again and again and again. And by the end, I think we ended with students didn't agree on everything, but they had a better understanding of why people thought what they did, and maybe they weren't as extreme as they were presented in the first place. And what could we say, and what did people who, for instance, the biracial students, what did they need to say to the people who were saying I'm against mixing of races? So So I think that that's going to happen. And in fact, like I said, the students, they all across the board thought this was one of the best classes they ever had, because we did the difficult work of working through that. I don't say there's a happy ending all the time, but I think if we struggle and we struggle together, students learn a lot from that process.
That is a great story. And I think it's also an interesting thing to add that I imagine that many other faculty members wouldn't necessarily have the skill set to do what you did. And that's something that we can also teach people. And it's another muscle to exercise. I want to try to get to two other questions that are in the queue. One, I'm just going to give you to think about, and maybe we can send out in our recap email. It says, are there any books you would recommend that we can give to students if they want to learn more about how to communicate social justice to others? Okay, so I'll put that away for 1 second. And then another question, which I'd love to have you answer live, is what strategies are successful for students to reach out to their professors, especially in regard to community engagements, for instance, like the situation at UCSC and other UC schools like the Wildcat strike, which had to do with grad students and their needs being met. So how do students reach out to their professors in an effective way?
Okay, and I'm not sure like what that means specifically. I mean, if it's to say like I want to be out of class so I can go participate in the actions, I mean, there's certainly there's that, and I think that comes up sometimes. For me, students want to say, well, I can't be in your class today because I have to go do this. I say, well, wait. There are other opportunities too. Like, really, is this? But maybe not. Maybe they do have to go there, and so we negotiate. So I think encouraging students to do this in advance and talk about why and provide good reasons and all of that sort of thing. The other thing, though, that I do hope that students can do, and I hope faculty would be receptive to, is, using the classroom and the assignments that are there and as a base for some of the things that they want to do. So for instance, if there's a student who in that class are going to need to do a research project on X, Y, or Z, can this strike, or can the history of striking, or, which I did write a paper about, history of strikes at UCLA as an undergrad. So can they write that paper that would give them more information, that would ground them in the kinds of issues that everybody is facing now, or in strategies, for communicating, if that's appropriate to the class. And I realize there has to be a marriage there between the disciplinary content and the activism. But I think that faculty could really help students find that connection so that students can really apply their learning in that way. That's what I would recommend.
That's great. I mean, I also read the question to mean maybe might be difficult to ask professors to stand with them, and maybe there are specific ways to do that. I mean, I remember when I was an undergrad, I was very intimidated by my professors.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. Yes. Faculty should start letting them call them by their first name. All my students call me by my first name, so I don't think they're as intimidated anymore, but I get it. That is a challenge. And I do think, it seems to be getting worse, not better. I don't know that students seem to be fearful to be asking their professors. Again, what professors can do, I think we need to start with the professors and not put this on the backs of students, and let them know, listen, I'm here to support you in your learning. Where your learning is taking you, let me know. Tell me how I can help, and that maybe I love that a student would come to me and say, can you go with me here? And maybe I can. What I often say is, if my schedule permits, I'm going to be there. And it can't always be, but at least I'm aware. And can you share with me some information, that sort of thing. So I think the faculty, it's incumbent upon the faculty to really make it as easy as possible for the student, and recognizing how difficult it really is, for sure.
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, the lucky students who get to have you. And I just really want to tell you how grateful I am, and I imagine the participants are, for your insights and expertise. And I imagine people will connect with you offline to continue the conversation. I hope you're having a chance, Spoma, to look at the chat. There's just a lot of really nice comments. I'm going to ask you if you could forward the slide, Spoma, to the last one. And I want to let people know that this week the center launched a social media campaign to encourage voting and to direct folks to resources and tools. Follow us on Twitter if you don't already. Keep your eye out for our next workshop. In the meantime, I want to, of course, ask everyone to stay healthy, and I want to encourage everyone to vote. So let me go. Wait, there's one more. Okay, now checking the queue. I think we got most of them. anyway, I'll just say thank you again, Spoma. It's always a privilege.
And thanks to everybody. Any comments that you have that could, broaden my understanding too. I see a couple in here and I'll be reading them as well. Thank you.
And we'll send out a recap email with the video to share with others. And I'm going to ask Spoma to maybe suggest a couple of her favorites in terms of books about social justice and the videos. We're going to have a link to her research as well. All right, with that, have a good rest of the day.